How did kings sleep in medieval castles during harsh winters without modern heating? Relaxing history. Hey guys, tonight we're going back, way back, to a time when kings ruled kingdoms, knights pretended they weren't freezing, and castles looked majestic on the outside, but inside felt like, well, refrigerator dungeons with a draft problem. So go ahead, dim the lights, grab a blanket that is hopefully thicker than whatever medieval monarchs had in the 1200s, and get comfortable, because tonight we're going to talk about something surprisingly simple: how kings slept. Not how they fought battles, signed treaties, or made questionable political choices. Just how they tried not to die of frostbite while sleeping inside a giant stone icebox. And trust me, medieval kings had options. They had servants, money, privilege, and still barely managed to stay warm. So if you've ever complained about your AC being too cold at night, congratulations. You already lived a more luxurious life than 99% of medieval royalty. Let's drift into this chilly topic slowly, like the cold air seeping under the door of a royal bedchamber that was absolutely not insulated in any meaningful way whatsoever. The castle problem nobody talks about. So here's the thing people forget. Castles were not designed for comfort. They were designed for not dying. Specifically, not dying from angry neighbors, rival families, invading armies, and the occasional bored Viking. Stone walls, great for defense, terrible for warmth. Because what is stone? It's a giant, heat-sucking sponge that touches your soul and whispers, "You will never be warm again." Medieval kings knew this. They lived in these echoing fortresses where footsteps carried for minutes and winter winds whistled through arrow slits like nature's very own horror soundtrack. So the real question becomes, how exactly did kings handle bedtime? How did a king, dressed in velvet, wearing golden rings, dripping wealth, crawl into bed and still shiver like a wet dog in November? Let's float over to the royal bedroom. The royal bed. Giant, elevated, and weirdly crowded. First thing you'd notice in a medieval king's room, the bed was huge. Not because medieval people were tall, they weren't. Most kings were around 5'6", with the occasional long-legged anomaly. The bed was huge because kings didn't sleep alone. No, not for that reason. Get your mind out of the 1300s. Kings slept with servants, guards, attendants, warming boys. Yes, that was a job. And sometimes small animals for extra heat. We're talking anywhere from 2 to 6 humans in one sleeping space. A royal cuddle pile, basically. And these beds were high, ridiculously high, like small ladder required high. Why? Because, 1, being elevated meant you avoided rats, who were big fans of toes. 2, heat rises, so the higher, the warmer. And 3, it made the king look important, even while unconscious and drooling. The bed itself was less like a modern mattress and more like a wooden platform topped with straw, feathers, wool, and occasionally a suspicious lump no one wanted to investigate. But warmth? Still not great. So what next? Curtains, the medieval life hack. Royal beds had curtains, thick ones. Imagine a personal tent inside your bedroom. This was not for romance. This was for survival. Because castles didn't have closed windows. Glass existed, sure, but good luck finding enough to cover your 40-foot hallway. Instead, they had shutters, if you were lucky, and air gaps the size of your fist, if you weren't. So kings used bed curtains as their own microclimate. Once those curtains closed, the king essentially slept inside a tiny, slightly warmer bubble of human breath and wool blankets. Cozy, maybe. Stuffy? Absolutely. But better than turning into a royal popsicle. Some kings even had bed-warming pans, metal trays filled with hot coals that servants slid under the blankets, which sounds great until you remember that medieval fabric plus hot coals equals spontaneous kings on fire. It happened more than once. Because medieval life was nothing if not consistent. Warmth or safety? Pick one. Medieval kings rarely got both. Night clothes? Fashionably freezing. Royal pajamas were intense. Forget your soft cotton PJs. Kings slept in wool nightshirts, fur-lined robes, giant socks, sometimes hats, and occasionally gloves. Yes, kings wore hats to bed. The cold was that disrespectful. And if you're thinking, wow, that sounds like a lot of clothing to sleep in, it was. But wearing too little meant freezing, and wearing too much meant sweating. And sweating in winter meant waking up colder because your shirt absorbed moisture like a medieval sponge. So kings spent half the winter playing the medieval version of blanket on, too hot. Blanket off, immediate regret. Relatable. Fires. Loud, smoky, and absolutely inefficient. Castles had fireplaces. This is true, but effective heating would be a strong term. A medieval fireplace heated exactly three things: the king's toes, the one servant standing too close, and the upper corner of the room directly above the chimney. Everything else? Still cold. And keeping the fire going required staff, serious staff, people whose entire job was royal fire watcher. If the flames got too big, danger. If the flames got too small, frostbite. And if the smoke didn't flow correctly, you might get fumigated in your sleep like a royal ham. So relying on fire was complicated. Many kings preferred portable braziers, metal bowls full of burning charcoal placed around the room like medieval space heaters, with the charming side effect of occasionally poisoning people with carbon monoxide. Again, comfort or survival. Pick one. Medieval kings rarely got both. The warming boy situation. Yes, it was real. We need to talk about the strangest job in the castle, the warming boy. This was a servant, usually young, whose entire job was to warm the king's bed before the king got in, literally lying inside the bedding so his body heat could preheat the royal mattress. Imagine being paid to be a medieval electric blanket. Career goals? Unsure. The king would enter, the servant would leave, and boom, instant warmth. Well, instant meaning it wasn't icy anymore, just slightly less awful. Sometimes the job required two people, because medieval winters were dramatic like that. Animals, nature's space heaters. When all else failed, medieval people, including kings, used animals for warmth. Dogs especially. Royal lapdogs weren't fashion accessories. They were heating devices with eyes. A small dog under the blanket was basically a living hot water bottle. Some kings slept with multiple. If you've ever seen medieval artwork showing royal dogs everywhere, yeah, there was a reason. And if the king didn't like dogs, well, that's what the 3 to 5 extra humans in the bed were for. The bedroom layout: cold corners, warm spots, and drafts that could kill. Royal chambers were arranged strategically for warmth. The king's bed was usually in a corner, away from outer walls, near a fireplace, under a canopy, and behind a second set of curtains in really cold regions. Yes, some kings slept inside a curtain, inside another curtain. Medieval inception. Even so, they still dealt with draft.
If you're still awake, congratulations! You've already outperformed half the monarchs of medieval Europe, who routinely fell asleep sitting upright, wrapped in enough layers to qualify as human onions. So pull that blanket in a little closer, maybe sip something warm, and let's drift deeper into the cold, echoing corridors of medieval castles. Because if you think kings had a rough time trying to sleep in these stone refrigerators, queens might have had it worse. Let's float gently into their side of the story. Queens, the same cold plus expectations. Queens did not get a magical warm room perk. Their chambers were just as drafty, smoky, and questionably heated as the king's, sometimes even colder because they were often placed strategically near chapels or hallways for political symbolism, which is a poetic way of saying, "Your Majesty, we love you. Now please sleep next to this giant corridor where the winter wind shrieks like a dying goose." Queens had almost the same setup as kings. Huge canopy bed, heavy curtains, furs on top of furs, a fireplace that may or may not work, servants everywhere, and a random dog under the covers. But unlike kings, queens often had ladies-in-waiting, attendants, noblewomen, children, an occasional midwife. Basically, the queen's bedroom was a royal sleepover, minus the fun and plus the freezing. The queen's bed, also a public stage. Here's a fun thing people forget. Royal beds weren't just for sleeping. They were political stages. Important events happened in them. Births, healing rituals, mourning ceremonies, court gossip sessions, and yes, extremely awkward wedding night inspections in some countries. Imagine trying to sleep knowing your bedroom was basically the medieval equivalent of a conference room that also doubles as a maternity ward. Privacy? A charming myth. Warmth? Only if your attendants weren't standing near the curtains letting the cold air pour in like a disappointed ghost. Layers upon layers, Queen Edition. Queens wore even more to bed than kings did. We're talking thick linen camise, woolen undertunic, fur-lined robe, stockings, sometimes leg wraps, and a nightcap, and maybe another cap over the first one. Yes, medieval queens basically went to bed dressed like they were about to march through a snowstorm because often they kind of were. Their rooms were so cold that metal items, jewelry, combs, cups, were freezing to the touch. If you've ever accidentally grabbed a cold doorknob in winter and felt personally attacked by the universe, imagine that, but your entire room. Nighttime routines, slow, cold, and full of people. A queen's nighttime routine was remove the day's 7 layers, replace them with 7 different layers, have servants warm the sheets, hope the fireplace wasn't smoking, pray the wind didn't shift, get into bed, immediately feel cold anyway, pull the curtains shut, try to sleep while people whispered 2 feet away. And because queens had reputations to maintain, they couldn't just curl up like hedgehogs and burrow into the blankets. They had to maintain some level of dignity, even while freezing. Honestly, they deserved awards. Sleeping positions, the not-so-cozy reality. Kings and queens rarely slept lying flat. Why? cold airflow, superstitions, terrible pillows, tight clothing, joint pain, and the general medieval fear that lying flat made you too close to death. So many royals slept, half propped up, on piles of cushions, angled on one side, like they fell asleep reading a book and just gave up. It wasn't graceful, but it kept the blood flowing, and in winter, circulation was everything. Court members sleeping nearby, warmth and politics. Around the royal bed, you'd find chamberlains, personal attendants, ladies in waiting, scribes, guards, healers, the random noble cousin who refused to leave. These people slept on pallets on the floor or on benches or any flattish surface, which meant two things. The room felt slightly warmer due to all the bodies, and privacy did not exist at all, ever. The queen couldn't roll over dramatically without someone clearing their throat politely in the background. Warmth, +1. Peace of mind, -10. Sleep quality, somewhere between and I give up. Cold weather hacks, medieval royal edition. Royals used every trick they could think of. Number 1, bed warmers. Pan plus glowing coals equals preheated bed. Also, fire hazard. A surprising number of noble bedrooms caught fire this way. Number 2, multiple mattresses. Straw to wool to feathers to blankets to furs. Basically, a medieval lasagna of questionable comfort but decent insulation. Number 3, foot warmers. Little wooden or metal boxes filled with hot charcoal. Worked well. Also, portable carbon monoxide generators. Number 4, soaking in a warm bath before bed. Sounds lovely, except the water cooled fast. The room was cold, and walking back to bed soaking wet in winter was a great way to become a historical footnote. Number 5, drinking warm ale or wine. Not a bad idea, until you woke up 2 hours later needing to pee in a freezing chamber pot. Number 6, sleeping with dogs. Tiny medieval hand warmers with fur. Highly effective. Highly spoiled. A dog that belonged to a queen was living a better life than most of Europe. Night noises. A whole symphony of annoyances. Even if a queen managed to get warm, she still had to actually fall asleep, which was difficult because a medieval castle at night was not quiet. She had to deal with rattling shutters, wind howling through stone passageways, guards clanking armor, servants whispering, distant coughing, dogs moving under the blankets, the crackle of fire, footsteps on stone, the occasional rat party in the walls, monks in the chapel chanting before dawn. Imagine trying to sleep through all that. And remember, no white noise machine, unless you count the wind screaming through the arrow slits like it was auditioning for a ghost choir. The queen's struggle for health. Cold didn't just make sleep difficult. It caused chronic coughs, joint stiffness, chapped skin, lung problems, migraines, fatigue, and the charming medieval condition known as general misery. Queens were expected to look graceful at breakfast even after a night spent shivering like a nervous pigeon. 10 out of 10 effort, 0 out of 10 comfort. Elite children, frozen but fancy. Royal children had their own rooms in theory, but they usually slept with nurses, tutors, maids, sometimes other noble children, and a small dog they definitely weren't supposed to have, but did anyway. Their rooms were slightly warmer due to more people packed into small spaces, but still freezing because castles did not care about children. Special winter hazards for royal kids included cold floors, damp walls, frostbite, bed bugs, smoke from fires, drafty hallways, and the classic "my blanket is frozen at the corner" problem. If you ever hear someone say medieval royal life was glamorous, no, it wasn't. It was prestige wrapped in discomfort. Let's float toward the night guards, because while kings and queens were struggling to achieve basic warmth, the night guards had the worst winter job imaginable. Guards pacing freezing corridors, servants sleeping in clusters like penguins, the nighttime routine of a medieval castle, and why everyone was always tired.
If you're still with me, you've officially survived another metaphorical medieval winter night, which is honestly more than we can say for half the castle staff who were quietly freezing their toes off in some corridor while the king tried to sleep under a mountain of blankets. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's drift a little deeper into this nocturnal labyrinth. Tonight, we're not following kings or queens. We're following the people who kept the entire castle running after dark. The guards, the servants, the attendants, and the invisible support system that made royal sleep possible, or at least theoretically achievable. Let's wander quietly through those stone hallways. The night guards, sleep-deprived human icicles. If you think the king had trouble sleeping in a cold room, imagine being a guard stationed in a stone.
If you're still with me, you've officially survived another metaphorical medieval winter night, which is honestly more than we can say for half the castle staff, who were quietly freezing their toes off in some corridor while the king tried to sleep under a mountain of blankets. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's drift a little deeper into this nocturnal labyrinth. Tonight, we're not following kings or queens. We're following the people who kept the entire castle running after dark. The guards, the servants, the attendants, and the invisible support system that made royal sleep possible, or at least theoretically achievable. Let's wander quietly through those stone hallways. The night guards, sleep-deprived human icicles. If you think the king had trouble sleeping in a cold room, imagine being a guard stationed in a stone hallway that felt like an outdoor freezer someone accidentally built indoors. Night guards faced no fireplaces, no furs, no thick mattresses, no curtains to block drafts, and absolutely no sympathy. Their entire job was to pace back and forth like a very cold, very grumpy metronome. They wore wool, sure. They had cloaks, yes. But wool doesn't magically block wind when you're standing next to a giant arrow slit designed to ventilate the castle like an industrial wind tunnel. A typical night guard routine: walk 15 steps, turn, wonder if toes still exist, walk back, pray dawn comes soon, consider the life choices that led here. Repeat for 8 hours. Honestly, someone should have given them a medal just for not abandoning their post and curling into a ball of existential despair. The soundscape of night guard duty. A guard's night wasn't silent. Medieval castles were never silent. He heard wind moaning through stone cracks, distant animal sounds from the stables, fireplace pops echoing from noble rooms, people coughing, servants snoring, rats conducting midnight marathons, a dog barking 2 courtyards away, the chapel bell ringing at absurd hours, and occasionally absolutely nothing, which was somehow worse. And as he stood there listening to this medieval orchestra of noises, his job was to detect danger, which is difficult when everything sounds vaguely like danger. The warm spot myth. There's a common belief that guards had torches to keep warm. Yes, but also no. Torches provide light, occasional comfort, and sparks that threaten your cloak. They do not provide actual warmth. They're basically flaming candles that mock you. So guards had to rely on walking, stomping, rubbing hands, muttering prayers, and occasionally swearing quietly. If a torch went out due to a sudden gust of wind, which happened every 5 minutes, the guard had to relight it while questioning every meaningful choice he had ever made. Servants sleeping in clusters, the penguin approach. Unlike guards, servants actually got to sleep, just not comfortably. Servants slept in corridors, in side rooms, in shared chambers, on thin straw pallets, next to kitchens, behind staircases, under staircases, basically wherever heat existed. The warmest places in the castle were near the kitchen fires, near the laundry boiling room, near the bakehouse, near the dog kennels. The coldest places were everywhere else. So servants formed what I like to call medieval sleep piles. 5 or 6 people sharing 1 blanket, 2 cloaks, 3 questionable decisions. It looked almost cozy until you remembered the smell. Bathing wasn't exactly a nightly ritual. Everyone smelled like smoke, sweat, wool, damp reeds, and the occasional onion. But you know, warmth is warmth. You can't be picky. Night servants inside royal chambers. Some servants had to sleep sitting up in the royal bedroom in case the king or queen needed something at 3 a.m. These people did not lie down, did not get blankets, did not get a fire, did not complain, definitely complained internally. They were trained to stay awake through boredom, cold, low oxygen, smoky fireplaces, and the king snoring. Imagine trying to keep your eyes open while sitting on a stool in a dark room, the only sound being the rhythmic breathing of a monarch who was warm under 10 layers while you slowly turned into a historical popsicle. Congratulations, you've just simulated their entire career. The hallways, the coldest parts of the castle. If you've ever stepped into an old stone church in winter and immediately regretted your life, you already understand medieval hallways. Hallways in castles were long, narrow, unheated, twisting, echo-filled, and the perfect place to freeze to death. These corridors channeled cold air like a natural refrigeration system. So why were guards placed there? Because royalty liked safety more than warmth. It wasn't personal. It was just, please freeze on our behalf. Night fires, the strange rules of heating. Castles had fireplaces, yes, but not many. Fire was expensive, dangerous, and resource-intensive. By nighttime, most fires were reduced, covered with ash, diminished, half dead, waiting for morning. Only key areas stayed warmish. The Great Hall, if a fire was left burning, the kitchens, the main royal bedchambers, and sometimes a small guard room. Everywhere else, cold. Not normal cold. Why does the air taste like stone cold? Fear of nighttime. Superstition meets temperature. Medieval people were extremely superstitious at night. They believed spirits were active, demons wandered, ghosts whispered, the veil between worlds thinned, darkness was dangerous, sleep made you vulnerable. Combine all of that with a pitch-black hallway and the freezing breath fogging in front of you. No wonder guards walked briskly. Half of them were cold, the other half were scared. And honestly, both groups were correct. The royal household at night. A medieval royal household didn't shut down at night. It ran like a 24-hour city. While the king slept, others worked. Bakers mixing dough, kitchen staff preparing early meals, scribes copying documents, guards rotating shifts, stable boys tending animals, priests praying in chapels, messengers arriving late, laundresses heating water, blacksmiths finishing emergency repairs. A castle never truly slept. Its people just slept in pieces. Servant nightwear. The bare minimum. Servants didn't get multiple layers like royals. They slept in wool tunics, linen shirts, coarse stockings, maybe a cloak if they were lucky. They didn't have fur blankets. They had rough wool, thin straw pallets, and the occasional dog. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't warm, it was survival light. The problem of moisture, everyone's worst enemy. Cold alone is irritating, but cold plus moisture? That's medieval misery. Castles were damp because stone absorbs water, walls leaked, windows weren't sealed, the air was humid, fires created condensation, people breathed a lot in enclosed spaces. A servant might fall asleep on a nice dry pallet, only to wake up damp, cold, and regretting every decision that led them here. Early morning, the worst part of the night. Around 3 to 5 a.m., the temperature dropped to its lowest. This was when guards were most tired, servants were most frozen,
Servants were most frozen. Monarchs snored the loudest. Fireplaces were barely embers. Drafts intensified. Hope diminished. It was the moment when everyone wondered if the sun would ever rise again. And then, it did. All right, settle back in. Maybe pull a blanket up a little. Because now we're drifting into the part of medieval winter life that was less charming and more, wow, how did anyone survive this? Let's float back into the castle halls. So, you know how kings loved bragging about their wealth? The gold, the tapestries, the jeweled goblets. Well, winter didn't care about any of that. Even the wealthiest medieval rulers found themselves doing the same thing every regular villager did once January rolled around, shivering and praying the fireplace wouldn't go out. Royal privilege only went so far when your bedroom was basically a stone refrigerator with banners. The problem was simple. Stone walls. Stone is great for surviving sieges. Stone is absolutely awful at staying warm. Large rooms, plus high ceilings, plus medieval insulation, which is to say, none, equals nightly suffering. If you ever visit a surviving castle today, especially one in England, Scotland, or northern France, you'll probably notice that the moment you step into a chamber, you feel like your bones have entered hibernation. Now imagine that, but it's 1320, and it's snowing, and you don't have heated floors or central heating, just a fire that doesn't even warm the back of the room. Kings basically lived in beautiful, expensive ice boxes. Let's glide into the royal bedroom again. It's night. The fire is technically still burning, but it's doing that sad, tired flicker thing fires do when they've given up on life. The air in the room is cold enough that you can see your breath. And the king, despite being the most powerful man in the region, is curled up under an avalanche of blankets, cloaks, furs, and whatever else the servants could drag in. But even then, the bed wasn't just a bed. It was a microclimate. Those heavy drapes around the mattress, they weren't for style. They were basically the medieval version of a heated Fort Knox. They kept the warm air trapped in the bed because it sure wasn't staying anywhere outside it. If you ever see those old paintings where the royal bed looks like a tiny tent, yeah, that wasn't an aesthetic choice. That was survival engineering. And here's something mildly tragic. Sometimes, kings slept fully dressed in winter. Not because they wanted to, but because the chamber was so cold that undressing felt like a one-way ticket to pneumonia. There are accounts of nobles sleeping in undershirts, tunics, cloaks, woolen caps, fur-lined slippers, and sometimes even little gloves, because cold fingers at 3 a.m. are apparently a universal human experience, regardless of century. Imagine a king of England, someone with more money than most small countries at the time, lying there looking like a bundled-up toddler whose parents overdressed him for daycare. Let's drift into another scene. A royal servant quietly enters before dawn. He approaches the fireplace. He doesn't say a word. He just starts reviving the fire like he's performing some sacred winter ritual. This was called the morning fire duty. An unglamorous job, but essential. If the king woke up to a cold room, everyone had a bad morning. And medieval kings weren't exactly known for their good mood personalities. Some kings even demanded multiple overnight fire checks. Poor servants wandering around half asleep, trying not to sneeze or trip over furniture just to make sure the royal room didn't turn into a glacier. But here's the twist. Even though fireplaces were huge in castle chambers, they weren't very efficient. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney. So medieval architects tried weird things like angling the back wall of the fireplace to reflect heat outward. It helped a little, but not enough to stop the nightly shivering. Honestly, if you time traveled and gave a medieval king a modern space heater, he'd probably knight you on the spot. And then there were warming pans. These were basically long-handled metal pans filled with hot coals. Servants would slide them between the king's sheets before he got in, warming the bed. Which sounds cozy, except sometimes the sheets caught fire, which is slightly less cozy. Imagine being half asleep and smelling smoke because your bed is quietly becoming a medieval barbecue grill. The past was a strange place. Let's drift over to something else kings hated: drafts. Even with tapestries covering the walls, cold air found its way through cracks, windows, doors, arrow slits, basically anywhere it could slip in and ruin the mood. Royal complaints about drafts are everywhere in records. It's kind of funny reading the irritated notes kings left behind. Too cold. Wind entering the chamber. Fix this immediately. Sir, your walls are 7 feet thick. There's only so much anyone can do. Some kings demanded entire tapestries be moved from other parts of the castle to block a draft that only they seemed to be able to feel. A medieval ruler could ignore famine, political chaos, or a brewing rebellion. But a cold breeze? Absolutely unacceptable. So how cold was it really? Let's float into a realistic snapshot. In many regions of Europe, castle bedrooms in winter regularly drop to around 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. Inside, not outside. Which means waking up to frost forming near the windows was unusual. There are mentions of servants finding ice on water basins inside royal chambers. You know it's cold when the king's shaving water freezes. And that brings us gently to the next part, where we drift into the quirks, habits, and borderline ridiculous things medieval elites did to stay warm, because kings were dramatic, and winter gave them plenty to be dramatic about.
All right, pull your blanket up a little higher, because now we're sliding into the part of the story where kings stop pretending to be majestic and start acting like cold, irritated humans just trying to make it through January. Let's drift back into the castle corridors. So picture a medieval king. He's powerful, he's feared, he commands armies, and he's pacing around his bedroom, complaining that his feet are cold. Because, of course, he is. Winter didn't care about status, and medieval kings, despite their crowns, their titles, and their armies, spent most of the season trying to stay warm in increasingly creative ways. Let's float through some of those tactics. 1.
The royal bed transformation ritual. Remember how the bed was basically a tiny heated fortress? Well, every night, servants performed what basically amounted to a thermal engineering ceremony. They brought in extra fur throws, woolen blankets, velvet covers, sometimes even entire fur pelts. Think full fox, marten, or ermine. And then they layered them like they were assembling the world's most luxurious winter lasagna. The king slept under a stack so heavy that rolling over was basically impossible. If you woke up stuck in one position, tough luck. You were a medieval Netflix user trapped under 18 layers of blankets. 2. The bed warmers, medieval edition. We touched on warming pans earlier, but let's gently float back to them. Servants filled metal pans with glowing coals, slid them between the sheets, moved them around, and tried not to start a royal inferno. A surprising number of things caught fire in medieval bedrooms: sheets, blankets, mattresses, curtains, bed canopies. Basically, everything in the room besides the king. Some warming pans even had little bells attached, not for decoration, but so servants could hear if the pan accidentally tipped over. Nothing tucks you into sleep like knowing your bed needs a built-in warning system. 3. The royal nightcap. No, not the alcohol one. Kings wore sleeping caps, and not because they looked adorable. Heat escapes through the head, so medieval rulers protected theirs with wool caps, fur-lined hats, silk-wrapped headpieces, sometimes even double-layered caps. It created a sort of medieval pajama chic vibe. Not very majestic, but very warm. Historians love to remind us that even Henry VIII slept wearing a velvet-lined nightcap. Yes, the same Henry who had 6 wives and a personal choir also had a bedtime hat like a 90-year-old grandpa. 4. Foot warmers. Kings were obsessed with keeping their feet warm. They used wooden boxes filled with hot coals, fur-lined slippers, layered socks, and occasionally small dogs. Yes, lap dogs. Some royal families kept tiny companion dogs not because they were cute, though they were, but because they functioned as portable heaters. Imagine being so rich that you used a living creature as a heated blanket. 5. Hot stones, but make it royal. Servants heated large stones in the fireplace, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them near the king's bed, under benches, or even under the covers. It was like the medieval version of a hot water bottle, minus the water and plus the risk of minor burns. 6. The royal room shuffle. Because winter made everything miserable, kings sometimes just moved bedrooms. Seriously, some rulers rotated through chambers depending on temperature, using whichever room was least drafty and offensive. Imagine having a house with 90 rooms, but only 2 that aren't trying to kill you with cold airflow. 7. Closing the winter curtains, a dramatic affair. We tend to forget this, but medieval bedrooms had curtains not just around the bed, but often across the entire room. Servants pulled heavy tapestry curtains across walls and windows to create smaller, warmer zones. It made the room darker, claustrophobic, and slightly depressing, but at least it stopped the wind from slapping the king in the face at 2 a.m. 8. Bath in winter? Absolutely not. Kings hated winter bathing. Even with heated water, the idea of exposing bare skin to a cold room was practically medieval torture. Some rulers skipped baths for months. Perfume, powder, and heavy clothing did the rest. Everyone stank. It was a collective medieval experience. If you ever wondered why tapestries depicting kings never show them smiling, well, now you know. 9. Early bedtime equals survival mode. Kings often went to bed much earlier during winter, not because they were sleepy, but because the bed was the warmest thing in the castle. By 7 or 8 p.m., the king was already cocooned under 40 pounds of blankets like a hibernating royal hedgehog. And 10. Fireplace worship. Kings literally worshipped the fireplace in winter. Some rulers ordered the reconstruction of entire hearths because the fire didn't please them. One king of France once had an entire chamber redesigned because he disliked the angle of the wind coming down the chimney. Royal priorities were interesting. And that brings us to the gentler next chapter. We're drifting toward the lives of the queens, because if you think kings were dramatic about winter, the royal women of medieval Europe elevated cold weather suffering into an art form. All right, let's settle in again. The blankets are pulled up, the fire is low, and now we're drifting into the quieter, colder side of medieval winter life, the world of the queens. If you think kings suffered in winter, medieval queens took the experience and added layers of protocol, discomfort, and expectations wrapped in fur, silk, and societal nonsense. Let's drift slowly into that world. Queens and the unheated reality of luxury. People tend to imagine queens living in warm, candlelit luxury. But medieval queens slept in rooms that, realistically, were about as warm as a stone shed in December. Large, drafty, echoing spaces, high ceilings designed to impress, not insulate. And windows, oh, the windows. Glass was expensive and often small, so huge openings were covered with cloth, parchment, wooden shutters, or, if you are incredibly lucky, panes of wavy glass that still let the wind scream through. So yes, queens froze, just more elegantly. Royal Wardrobe, Winter Edition. While kings could throw on thick wool and call it a day, queens dealt with a more complex equation. Fashion plus status plus modesty plus comfort equals impossible. Winter outfits included layers of linen shifts, heavy wool gowns, fur-lined overgowns, cloaks that weighed as much as a medium-sized horse, and sometimes tiny hand warmers hidden in sleeves. Queens often used ermine, a status fur, because nothing says royal elegance than dressing in small white ferrets with black-tipped tails. The bed of a queen, a winter fortress. Queen beds weren't just beds, they were structures, a small stage where nightly rituals happened. Curtains were drawn shut to keep in heat, extra tapestries were hung around the bed frame, multiple maids layered heavy blankets, furs, and quilts, and a warming pan was run underneath, carefully so the queen didn't wake up roasted. Sometimes queens slept upright on tons of pillows, not for comfort, but because it was believed lying flat disrupted digestion. So imagine being freezing cold and also sleeping like a politely inclined statue. The ritual of being put to bed. Queens didn't just go to bed, there was an entire ceremony. Multiple attendants helped undress, wash feet, adjust hair, prepare linens, and ensure every item was properly arranged. Even in winter, the queen's bedroom was not private. There were ladies-in-waiting, chambermaids, guards, and sometimes even courtiers allowed to watch certain parts of the bedtime ritual. Privacy? Not really an option. Dignity? Only if you ignored the draft creeping up the side of the bed while 15 people watched you drink warm wine before sleep. Royal babies equal nighttime chaos. Nothing complicated winter nights like royal infants. Baby rooms weren't warmer, they were just smaller and equally cold. Queens often slept closer to their babies in winter, not out of maternal instinct alone, but because babies were basically tiny space heaters. Some queens let their infants into their beds despite etiquette rules forbidding it. Imagine explaining that to a court official. Yes, I am the Queen of England. Yes, I broke protocol, but my hands were cold. Seems reasonable. The great winter distraction techniques. Queens relied heavily on distraction to survive long winter nights. Embroidery, soft music, storytelling, warm scented oils, heated stones wrapped in cloth, and even small pets, especially lapdogs. Some queens slept with dogs not because they were lonely, but because they were warm. Royal lapdogs were again little medieval radiators that barked occasionally. Health problems from sleeping cold. The cold didn't just cause discomfort, it caused problems. Stiff joints, chest congestion, tooth pain, headaches, melancholy, a medieval term for depression plus cold weather plus boredom. Some royal doctors even diagnosed winter sadness of the blood, which honestly sounds like a perfect description of January in any century. Winter pregnancy, a whole new layer of suffering. Pregnant queens in winter? That was a special experience. The cold made every discomfort worse. Swollen feet, shivering, trouble sleeping, extra heavy gowns, constant doctor visits, fear of illness. And let's not forget, castles were cold hospitals with bad air circulation. Winter pregnancies were stressful, slow, uncomfortable, and often closely monitored. No wonder royal diaries from winter months read like exhausted survival notes. Winter pregnancy, a whole new layer of suffering. Winter pregnancies? All right, let's drift deeper into the castle. We've spent enough time with kings and queens under their heavy curtains and mountain-shaped blankets. Now we'll let them sleep and quietly wander into the rest of the structure, the parts no one romanticizes, but everyone depended on. Because here's the truth. A medieval castle in winter was basically a giant refrigerator made of stone, with people living inside it anyway. Let's float into those cold hallways. Servants, the true winter survivors. If you were a servant in a castle during winter, warmth was more of a rumor than an experience. Royal chambers got the best fires. Everyone else got whatever heat drifted through cracks, which was usually none. Servants slept in side rooms, in lofts above storage, in narrow bunks built into walls, in group sleeping areas near the kitchens, or wherever the steward pointed and said, "This is fine." They relied on rough wool blankets, straw mattresses, shared body heat, leftover ashes from the kitchen hearth. Imagine sleeping in a room small enough to be called a nook, with 4 other people breathing loudly, and a window that let in the night air like it had a personal grudge. It wasn't cozy, but it was survivable. The kitchen at midnight, the warmest place in the castle. If you were freezing after a long shift, working in the kitchens was basically winning the medieval lottery. Kitchens had huge hearths, constant fires, warm pots bubbling, steam rising from cauldrons. People slept on benches, some curled up near oven walls. A few lucky ones snuck into storage rooms wrapped in flour sacks. The cooks hated it, but winter was winter and warmth was warmth. Guards, frozen half-statues in armor. Castle guards didn't sleep so much as rotate between frozen misery and slightly less frozen misery. Armor, if worn in winter, became a personal refrigerator. Night watch meant numb fingers, boots stiff with frost, torches that wouldn't stay lit, pacing back and forth so you didn't die. And their beds? A straw pallet, maybe a wool cloak, maybe a dog if you were lucky and bribed someone. Many guards slept sitting upright with cloaks pulled over their heads, looking like unhappy medieval mushrooms. Guests, the cold room experience. Royal guests expected comfort. What they often got was drafty hospitality. If you were a minor noble visiting for winter festivities, you were shown to a nice room, nicely decorated, with nice tapestries and absolutely no heat. Many guest rooms had fireplaces, but no servants to maintain them all night. So the fire went out, the temperature dropped, and you woke up feeling like an elegantly frozen ham. Some guests brought personal servants just to keep fires alive. Others bundled themselves like soft furniture under layers of fur. Children of the castle, cold but resilient. Castles had children running everywhere, royal kids, noble children, servants' little ones, pages and squires. They slept in small communal rooms, on wooden pallets, sharing blankets, near warm corridors if they were lucky. Kids, being flexible little creatures, usually handled winter better than the adults. Most ran around so much that they warmed themselves through sheer chaos. Monks and clerics inside castles. Some castles housed chapels with priests or monks who served the Lord. Their winter sleeping arrangements were the most theologically challenging. Imagine being a monk and trying to maintain spiritual focus when your toes were halfway to frostbite. They slept in unheated cells, simple wooden beds, thin blankets, a stone room designed for humility and spiritual discipline. A nice way of saying, you're going to freeze, but in a holy way. Pets were small, furry space heaters. Cats slept on beds. Dogs curled up with servants. Small lapdogs warmed noble women. Hunting dogs slept in packs for body heat. Animals were warmth, companionship, and occasionally a warning system if rats tried to steal grain in the night. The Great Hall at night. The Great Hall was the heart of the castle, and at night, in winter, it transformed. After dinner, the fires burned low. Benches became makeshift beds. Servants lay near the embers. Travelers found corners to curl up in. Guards warmed their hands before returning to duty. The hall became one giant medieval sleepover, with everyone snoring at different pitches. It wasn't glamorous, but it was one of the warmest rooms, and warmth always won. Storage rooms, unexpected cozy spots. Some people slept in storage areas because they were insulated, they were small, they had fewer windows, and the food inside stayed warmer. Sleeping near barrels of grain was surprisingly comfortable, until you woke up with a rat staring at you. how people discussed winter misery. Letters from castle residents often included complaints about cold floors, whining about drafts, notes about frost forming inside windows, requests for more blankets, prayers for early spring. People in castles suffered as much as anyone else, just with thicker walls and more expensive cloaks. Now that we've wandered through the less glamorous lives of everyone else in the castle, it's time to drift towards something even more interesting. How the architecture itself made winter brutal, and how medieval people tried to fix it.
All right, let's float into the bones of the castle itself. We've looked at kings, queens, servants, guards, and stray dogs, all trying to survive winter nights. Now we're going to drift deeper into the stone, the walls, the design choices that made medieval castles such majestic, freezing nightmares. Because here's the gentle truth. Castles were never built for comfort. They were built for not dying in war. Warmth was somewhere around priority number 10, maybe 15. Let's wander through those architectural quirks that made winter inside a castle feel like living inside a stone glacier. 1. Stone walls, beautiful, indestructible, completely freezing. Castle walls were often 6 to 30 feet thick. Stone doesn't warm up. Stone doesn't get cozy. Stone doesn't care about your emotional well-being. It absorbs the cold from outside and radiates it inward all night like a giant medieval air conditioner that nobody asked for. Even if you had a roaring fire, the walls stayed cold, whispering, "No warmth for you, my lord." 2. Castle floors, the eternal ice slabs. Stone floors were the same story. Even with rushes, woven mats, or wooden planks laid on top, the cold seeped upward like it was consciously trying to ruin everyone's night. People wore fur-lined slippers, multiple socks, leather boots indoors, foot wraps, and still shuffled around like quietly miserable penguins. 3. Drafts, the uninvited castle residents. Castles were so full of draft gaps that medieval people didn't even try to stop them anymore. Air slipped in through windows, arrow slits, chimneys, loose stones, floor gaps, roof beams, keyholes, and sometimes just the general vibe of poor medieval carpentry. Every room was a wind tunnel. Even royal chambers felt like the outdoors with better furniture. 4. Windows, a masterclass in letting cold in. Glass? No, not unless you were unbelievably rich. Most castle windows were open holes, wooden shutters, parchment-covered frames, thin horn sheets, maybe a tiny leaded glass panel in noble quarters. None of these things kept out wind. All of them allowed drafts to swirl in like entitled guests. A burning fire could heat one side of your face. The window draft would freeze the other, a medieval two-temperature facial experience. 5. Chimneys. Late to the party. For centuries, castles didn't even have proper chimneys, just smoke holes, meaning heat escaped upward, smoke lingered downward, drafts sucked air across the room. You were cold and coughing, a lovely dual experience. Chimneys started improving around the 12th, 13th centuries, but even then the design was, let's say, optimistic. Wind often blew smoke back into rooms or pulled heat straight up and out. The Great Hall was one of the warmest places, but only when the hearth was lit. Servants kept feeding it. Doors stayed shut, and the wind didn't ruin everything. When the fire died in the night, the Great Hall turned into a stone refrigerator once again. People basically played chase the warmth all day. 7. Spiral staircases. Freezing wind funnels. You know those dramatic stone spiral staircases in castles? They acted like natural cold air centrifuges. The wind rushed upward or downward depending on the weather, turning stairways into icy vortexes. People avoided using them at night.
If you had to walk up one, your candle might blow out, which was a medieval version of a jump scare. 8. The roofs. Constant leaks, constant cold. Castles had thick stone walls, but the roofs were often wood, slate, tiles, thatch, older castles. Roofs leaked, roofs rattled, roofs creaked dramatically in storms, and a single hole meant water, snow, wind, misery. Castles echoed with the sound of dripping, which was probably very relaxing if you didn't live there. 9. Courtyards. Winter just lives there. Every castle had at least one courtyard, sometimes several. These acted like giant cold storage chambers that dragged cold air into every hallway. Walking to the kitchen?
All right, let's float into the bones of the castle itself. We've looked at kings, queens, servants, guards, and stray dogs, all trying to survive winter nights. Now we're going to drift deeper into the stone, the walls, the design choices that made medieval castles such majestic, freezing nightmares. Because here's the gentle truth. Castles were never built for comfort. They were built for not dying in war. Warmth was somewhere around priority number 10, maybe 15. Let's wander through those architectural quirks that made winter inside a castle feel like living inside a stone glacier. 1. Stone walls. Beautiful, indestructible, completely freezing. Castle walls were often 6 to 30 feet thick. Stone doesn't warm up. Stone doesn't get cozy. Stone doesn't care about your emotional well-being. It absorbs the cold from outside and radiates it inward all night, like a giant medieval air conditioner that nobody asked for. Even if you had a roaring fire, the walls stayed cold, whispering, "No warmth for you, my lord." Castle floors were the same story. Stone floors were the same story. Even with rushes, woven mats, or wooden planks laid on top, the cold seeped upward like it was consciously trying to ruin everyone's night. People wore fur-lined slippers, multiple socks, leather boots indoors, foot wraps, and still shuffled around like quietly miserable penguins. 3. Drafts, the uninvited castle residents. Castles were so full of draft gaps that medieval people didn't even try to stop them anymore. Air slipped in through windows, arrow slits, chimneys, loose stones, floor gaps, roof beams, keyholes, and sometimes just the general vibe of poor medieval carpentry. Every room was a wind tunnel. Even royal chambers felt like the outdoors with better furniture. 4. Windows. A masterclass in letting cold in. Glass? No, not unless you were unbelievably rich. Most castle windows were open holes, wooden shutters, parchment-covered frames, thin horn sheets, maybe a tiny leaded glass panel in noble quarters. None of these things kept out wind. All of them allowed drafts to swirl in like entitled guests. A burning fire could heat one side of your face. The window draft would freeze the other. A medieval two-temperature facial experience. 5. Chimneys. Late to the party. For centuries, castles didn't even have proper chimneys, just smoke holes, meaning heat escaped upward, smoke lingered downward, and drafts sucked air across the room. You were cold and coughing. A lovely dual experience. Chimneys started improving around the 12th, 13th centuries, but even then, the design was, let's say, optimistic. Wind often blew smoke back into rooms or pulled heat straight up and out. 6. The Great Hall. Warm, but only sometimes. The Great Hall was the warmest place, but only when the hearth was lit, servants kept feeding it, doors stayed shut, and the wind didn't ruin everything. When the fire died in the night, the Great Hall turned into a stone refrigerator once again. People basically played chase the warmth all day. 7. Spiral staircases, freezing wind funnels. You know those dramatic stone spiral staircases in castles? They acted like natural cold air centrifuges. The wind rushed upward or downward depending on the weather, turning stairways into icy vortexes. People avoided using them at night. If you had to walk up one, your candle might blow out, which was a medieval version of a jump scare. 8. The roofs. Constant leaks, constant cold. Castles had thick stone walls, but the roofs were often wood, slate, tiles, or thatch, older castles. Roofs leaked, roofs rattled, roofs creaked dramatically in storms, and a single hole meant water, snow, wind, and misery. Castles echoed with the sound of dripping, which was probably very relaxing if you didn't live there. 9. The courtyards. Winter just lives there. Every castle had at least one courtyard, sometimes several. These acted like giant cold storage chambers that dragged cold air into every hallway. Walking to the kitchen? Cold. Walking to chapel? Cold. Going to the latrine tower at midnight? Cold, terrifying, and slippery. The courtyard basically ensured winter was always invited inside. 10. Insulation, nearly non-existent. Medieval people eventually tried tapestries, wall hangings, carpets on walls, wooden paneling, stuffed rushes, woven drapes. These helped, but not enough. Tapestries created pockets of warm air against the stone, but you had to be practically glued to them to feel the difference. 11. Wind towers.
All right, let's float into the bones of the castle itself. We've looked at kings, queens, servants, guards, and stray dogs, all trying to survive winter nights. Now we're going to drift deeper into the stone, the walls, the design choices that made medieval castles such majestic, freezing nightmares. Because here's the gentle truth. Castles were never built for comfort. They were built for not dying in war. Warmth was somewhere around priority number 10, maybe 15. Let's wander through those architectural quirks that made winter inside a castle feel like living inside a stone glacier. 1. Stone walls. Beautiful, indestructible, completely freezing. Castle walls were often 6 to 30 feet thick. Stone doesn't warm up. Stone doesn't get cozy. Stone doesn't care about your emotional well-being. It absorbs the cold from outside and radiates it inward all night like a giant medieval air conditioner that nobody asked for. Even if you had a roaring fire, the walls stayed cold, whispering, "No warmth for you, my lord." 2. Castle floors, the eternal ice slabs. Stone floors were the same story. Even with rushes, woven mats, or wooden planks laid on top, the cold seeped upward like it was consciously trying to ruin everyone's night. People wore fur-lined slippers, multiple socks, leather boots indoors, foot wraps, and still shuffled around like quietly miserable penguins. 3. Drafts, the uninvited castle residents. Castles were so full of draft gaps that medieval people didn't even try to stop them anymore. Air slipped in through windows, arrow slits, chimneys, loose stones, floor gaps, roof beams, keyholes, and sometimes just the general vibe of poor medieval carpentry. Every room was a wind tunnel. Even royal chambers felt like the outdoors with better furniture. 4. Windows, a masterclass in letting cold in. Glass? No, not unless you were unbelievably rich. Most castle windows were open holes, wooden shutters, parchment-covered frames, thin horn sheets, maybe a tiny leaded glass panel in noble quarters. None of these things kept out wind. All of them allowed drafts to swirl in like entitled guests. A burning fire could heat one side of your face. The window draft would freeze the other, a medieval two-temperature facial experience. 5. Chimneys. Late to the party.
For centuries, castles didn't even have proper chimneys, just smoke holes, meaning heat escaped upward, smoke lingered downward, drafts sucked air across the room. You were cold and coughing. A lovely dual experience. Chimneys started improving around the 12th, 13th centuries, but even then the design was, let's say, optimistic. Wind often blew smoke back into rooms or pulled heat straight up and out. The Great Hall was one of the warmest places, but only when the hearth was lit. Servants kept feeding it. Doors stayed shut, and the wind didn't ruin everything. When the fire died in the night, the Great Hall turned into a stone refrigerator once again. People basically played Chase the Warmth all day. 7. Spiral staircases. Freezing wind funnels. You know those dramatic stone spiral staircases in castles? They acted like natural cold air centrifuges. The wind rushed upward or downward depending on the weather, turning stairways into icy vortexes. People avoided using them at night. If you had to walk up one, your candle might blow out, which was a medieval version of a jump scare. 8. The roofs. Constant leaks, constant cold. Castles had thick stone walls, but the roofs were often wood, slate, tiles, thatch. Older castles. Roofs leaked, roofs rattled, roofs creaked dramatically in storms, and a single hole meant water, snow, wind, misery. Castles echoed with the sound of dripping, which was probably very relaxing if you didn't live there. 9. Courtyards. Winter just lives there. Every castle had at least one courtyard, sometimes several. These acted like giant cold storage chambers that dragged cold air into every hallway. Walking to the kitchen?
All right, let's float into the bones of the castle itself. We've looked at kings, queens, servants, guards, and stray dogs, all trying to survive winter nights. Now we're going to drift deeper into the stone, the walls, the design choices that made medieval castles such majestic, freezing nightmares. Because here's the gentle truth. Castles were never built for comfort. They were built for not dying in war. Warmth was somewhere around priority number 10, maybe 15. Let's wander through those architectural quirks that made winter inside a castle feel like living inside a stone glacier. 1. Stone walls. Beautiful, indestructible, completely freezing. Castle walls were often 6 to 30 feet thick. Stone doesn't warm up. Stone doesn't get cozy. Stone doesn't care about your emotional well-being. It absorbs the cold from outside and radiates it inward all night, like a giant medieval air conditioner that nobody asked for. Even if you had a roaring fire, the walls stayed cold, whispering, "No warmth for you, my lord." Castle floors were the same story. Stone floors were the same story. Even with rushes, woven mats, or wooden planks laid on top, the cold seeped upward like it was consciously trying to ruin everyone's night. People wore fur-lined slippers, multiple socks, leather boots indoors, foot wraps, and still shuffled around like quietly miserable penguins. 3. Drafts, the uninvited castle residents. Castles were so full of draft gaps that medieval people didn't even try to stop them anymore. Air slipped in through windows, arrow slits, chimneys, loose stones, floor gaps, roof beams, keyholes, and sometimes just the general vibe of poor medieval carpentry. Every room was a wind tunnel. Even royal chambers felt like the outdoors with better furniture. 4. Windows. A masterclass in letting cold in. Glass? No, not unless you were unbelievably rich. Most castle windows were open holes, wooden shutters, parchment-covered frames, thin horn sheets, maybe a tiny leaded glass panel in noble quarters. None of these things kept out wind. All of them allowed drafts to swirl in like entitled guests. A burning fire could heat one side of your face. The window draft would freeze the other. A medieval two-temperature facial experience. 5. Chimneys. Late to the party. For centuries, castles didn't even have proper chimneys, just smoke holes, meaning heat escaped upward, smoke lingered downward, and drafts sucked air across the room. You were cold and coughing. A lovely dual experience. Chimneys started improving around the 12th, 13th centuries, but even then, the design was, let's say, optimistic. Wind often blew smoke back into rooms or pulled heat straight up and out. 6. The Great Hall. Warm, but only sometimes. The Great Hall was the warmest place, but only when the hearth was lit, servants kept feeding it, doors stayed shut, and the wind didn't ruin everything. When the fire died in the night, the Great Hall turned into a stone refrigerator once again. People basically played chase the warmth all day. 7. Spiral staircases, freezing wind funnels. You know those dramatic stone spiral staircases in castles? They acted like natural cold air centrifuges. The wind rushed upward or downward depending on the weather, turning stairways into icy vortexes. People avoided using them at night. If you had to walk up one, your candle might blow out, which was a medieval version of a jump scare. 8. The roofs. Constant leaks, constant cold. Castles had thick stone walls, but the roofs were often wood, slate, tiles, or thatch, older castles. Roofs leaked, roofs rattled, roofs creaked dramatically in storms, and a single hole meant water, snow, wind, and misery. Castles echoed with the sound of dripping, which was probably very relaxing if you didn't live there. 9. The courtyards. Winter just lives there. Every castle had at least one courtyard, sometimes several. These acted like giant cold storage chambers that dragged cold air into every hallway. Walking to the kitchen? Cold. Walking to chapel? Cold. Going to the latrine tower at midnight? Cold, terrifying, and slippery. The courtyard basically ensured winter was always invited inside. 10. Insulation, nearly non-existent. Medieval people eventually tried tapestries, wall hangings, carpets on walls, wooden paneling, stuffed rushes, woven drapes. These helped, but not enough. Tapestries created pockets of warm air against the stone, but you had to be practically glued to them to feel the difference. 11. Wind towers and parapets, winter's personal delivery system. Castle towers were notorious for catching winter wind. They funneled it down into lower chambers. Guards stationed up top were basically human icicles with weapons. Even in royal towers, the wind sang all night, rattling shutters and groaning through beams. 12. Firewood logistics, the winter nightly drama. Firewood had to be cut, aged, dried, hauled, stored, distributed, managed, rationed. Running out of seasoned wood meant smoky fire, low heat, bad sleep, cranky nobility, miserable servants. Winter firewood shortages were surprisingly common. Even kings felt the pinch when someone mismanaged the woodpile. 13. The castle layout itself. Castles were designed for defense, intimidation, arrow angles, gatehouses, sieges, but not comfort, which means tall ceilings, wide halls, cold stairways, massive rooms, stone everywhere. All of this created echoing, draft-filled spaces, a winter acoustic nightmare. 14. The one warm room, the solar. Eventually, castle architects got tired of people freezing and invented the solar, a private, smaller chamber designed to be warm. It had smaller windows, wood paneling, a personal fireplace, thick tapestries, fewer drafts. Kings and queens loved the solar. They practically lived there in winter. It was the medieval version of a heated reading nook. 15. Why medieval people just accepted it. Cold was normal. Drafts were normal. Waking up with frost inside your window was normal. Sleeping under furs until you nearly suffocated was also normal. Comfort wasn't the expectation. Survival was. And even kings, queens, and wealthy nobles accepted that stone walls came with lifelong winter suffering. Now that we understand why castles were so cold, it's time to drift into something cozier. How medieval sleep routines, rituals, and beliefs shaped nightly life in these icy fortresses. How did kings sleep in medieval castles during harsh winters? All right, let's drift gently into the next part of our sleepy little exploration of how medieval royalty somehow survived winter nights without turning into human ice sculptures. So far, we've covered cold stone, colder rooms, and bed canopies that worked harder than most kings. Now let's float over to something oddly fascinating. Royal winter pajamas that weren't actually pajamas. So, here's the funny thing about medieval sleepwear. There wasn't really such a thing. Kings didn't have pajamas the way we imagined them today. No striped blue sets, no cute little matching tops and bottoms, definitely no silk dragon print nightwear because he's a king and he deserves it. Instead, they slept in what was basically their regular soft underclothes. Linen shirts, sometimes woolen tunics, occasionally something fur-lined, because of course they did. But here's the kicker. Many kings slept fully dressed, not because they were style icons, but because the room was so cold that undressing felt like a death wish. Imagine trying to unbutton anything while your breath is fogging like a dragon and your fingers have the dexterity of 2 frozen carrots. No thank you. So kings did what any reasonable person would do. They said, "Not tonight," and climbed into bed wearing half their wardrobe. Royal socks, or footcloths. They didn't exactly have socks as we know them today. Instead, they had something called footcloths, which sounds the least imaginative product name in history. Basically, long strips of wool, wrapped around the feet like a strange medieval burrito, tucked under the toes for warmth, and sometimes layered again if the king was fancy, or freezing. And yes, they sometimes slept with boots on, because nothing says, "I am king of all this land," than going to bed wearing the same shoes you walked through a muddy courtyard in. Nightcaps. The medieval MVP. If you've ever wondered why old paintings show people wearing pointy hats in bed, this is why. Nightcaps were absolutely essential. The medieval logic was simple. If the head is warm, the body follows. Also, medieval haircuts were not designed for winter. Shaved necks, open ears, and drafts? Bad combination. Kings wore linen caps, woolen caps, fur-trimmed caps if they were feeling dramatic, 2 caps at once if things were desperate. Imagine the royal dignity of a king sitting on his throne in a jeweled crown at noon, and sitting in bed at midnight in what looked like a floppy sock on his head. But hey, warmth is warmth. The bed curtains, not decoration, but survival gear. Let's glide back to those bed curtains for a second because they deserve respect. They weren't cute. They weren't stylish. They weren't romantic. They were basically medieval climate control. Heavy wool, velvet, brocade, anything thick enough to block the cold, the wind, and occasionally the sounds of mice scurrying across the floor like tiny burglars. Inside those curtains, the king could trap body heat, the heat from bed warmers, the heat from his partner, and sometimes the heat from a small dog or two. Yes, royal lapdogs were actually living space heaters. History is amazing. Speaking of dogs, medieval hot water bottles. Small dogs were actually bred for warmth. Not kidding. Breeds like pugs, Maltese, toy spaniels were raised to sit on laps, sleep under blankets, and warm cold royal feet. So if you've ever wondered why certain dog breeds exist that appear to do absolutely nothing, this is why. They had one job: keep the king warm. And honestly, they excelled. Kings also slept in layers, ridiculous layers. A king might go to bed wearing a linen undershirt, a woolen tunic, a thicker over-tunic, footcloths, gloves, a nightcap, a cloak, and sometimes a second cloak because moderation didn't exist yet. Yes, they slept looking like someone who gave up halfway through packing for winter. If a modern person slept like this, they would wake up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat. A medieval king woke up thinking, "Ah, yes, another night where I didn't freeze to death. Lovely." And how did they survive? By doing what medieval people always did. Layer everything. Bundle up, complain about the cold, and then repeat it all the next night. Because winter wasn't a season. It was a personality test.
All right, let's drift a little deeper into the medieval night. The torches are dim, the corridors are quiet, the castle walls are groaning like old ships in the wind, and somewhere behind 3 layers of tapestries, our king is preparing for bed in the slowest, coldest, least glamorous way imaginable. Because yes, royal bedtime was a whole ritual, not a relaxing spa routine, more like a tactical battle against frostbite. The royal pre-sleep routine, aka Operation Don't Freeze Tonight. Before a king even touched the bed, there was a sequence of tasks performed with the seriousness of a military operation. Step 1, warm the bedding. Servants would take hot stones wrapped in cloth or metal pans filled with glowing coals and slide them between the sheets. Was this safe? No. Did medieval people do it anyway? Absolutely. If your entire castle feels like a giant refrigerator, you'll take your chances. Step 2. Inspect the bed for surprise guests. Not humans. Rats, bedbugs, moths, anything with legs. Servants would shake the blankets like they were preparing to summon a demon, hoping to dislodge whatever tiny intruder had decided to spend the night with the king. Imagine being royalty and still having to worry about something crawling across your face at 2 a.m. Truly humbling. Step 3. The final room check. Before lights were extinguished, servants would close the shutters, check for drafts, tug on the tapestries, adjust the curtains, and sometimes stuff cloth into cracks in the walls, all to stop cold air from rushing in. But, you know, it still rushed in. Medieval walls were so drafty they practically whistled lullabies through the gaps. Another strange habit, sleeping sitting up.
Let's glide over to one of the most curious medieval sleep beliefs. Kings often slept half-sitting, almost like they were in a recliner that hadn't been invented yet. Why? Well, medieval medical theory said lying flat was dangerous. They believed it caused bad humors to rise. It made breathing harder. It increased the risk of night vapors and might, supposedly, invite evil spirits. So many kings slept upright, propped on huge pillows like a stack of oddly royal pancakes. They did this for years, decades, entire lifetimes. Imagine sleeping every night like you're trying to watch TV in bed without crushing your spine. No wonder they all woke up cranky. Kings also had night privileges. They were not glamorous. They were not fancy. They were not majestic. They were chamber pots. Yes, even kings weren't about to walk across a freezing castle in the dark just to find a toilet. So, beside the royal bed sat a decorated pot, a wooden lid, sometimes perfumed herbs, and the dignity of exactly 0 people involved. In the morning, servants collected everything while pretending not to judge their monarch's digestive choices. And so the cycle repeated. Winter nights were long, very long. In medieval Europe, winter nights lasted up to 14 hours. That's a lot of time to lie there, trying not to shiver, trying not to move, trying not to think about drafts, trying not to suffocate in 12 layers of blankets, and trying to pretend the dog at your feet wasn't slowly taking over the entire bed. People often slept in 2 segments: first sleep, midnight wake-up, second sleep. The middle of the night period was used for prayer, reading, thinking, or just staring at the ceiling, wondering if tomorrow would also be freezing. Answer: yes. Kings used this time to think about politics, taxes, wars, and probably why their toes still felt like frozen peas. And still, they slept surprisingly well. Despite the cold, the drafts, the noises, and the fact that their bedding weighed as much as a small horse, kings usually slept fine. Why? Because they were used to it. The human body adapts. And honestly, medieval days were exhausting. If you spent your afternoons settling disputes, riding horses, listening to long sermons, and pretending not to be annoyed by your own noggles, you'd probably fall asleep pretty quickly too, even in a room cold enough to store meat.
Let's float a little deeper into the medieval night, back into the king's bedroom, where, ironically, the king was almost never alone. Because medieval kings did not just sleep in their beds, they performed in them. The royal bed was not a private object the way we think of it today. It was a symbol, a stage, a piece of political furniture. And unfortunately for kings who just wanted a peaceful winter nap, this meant their bedchamber was basically the medieval equivalent of a semi-public lounge. The getting ready for bed audience. Before the king could lie down, there was a whole ceremonial bedtime routine known as the coucher. Servants, nobles, officials, even random courtiers hoping to be noticed crowded into the bedchamber. Imagine trying to fall asleep after a dozen people bow to you, 2 more hand you your nightshirt, someone adjusts your pillows, someone else warms your blanket, and 3 nobles stand there pretending this is completely normal. It was a formal ritual, a duty, a way for the king to grant small moments of favor simply by allowing someone to hold a sleeve or pass a candle. But it was absolutely not relaxing. Medieval kings essentially went to bed like exhausted celebrities surrounded by handlers. The bed was enormous because it had to be. Royal beds were massive, not because kings loved luxury, but because so many people shared the space. A king might sleep with his wife, his personal guard, his preferred dog, a warming servant during winter, and possibly a couple of noble companions. Sleeping together was normal, not romantic, just practical. Human bodies produced warmth, and castles desperately needed every degree of heat they could get. So, yes, a king might end a harsh winter night wedged between his queen and a loyal knight who snored like a dying ox. Royalty had privileges, but personal space was not one of them. The king's bed was also a meeting room. Let's glide into another odd detail. Kings held meetings in their beds. And I don't mean they sat up comfortably with tea, they fully stayed under the blankets while ambassadors delivered news, bishops complained, nobles requested favors, physicians offered advice, and scribes recorded everything. The bed was considered a royal throne during early mornings. Imagine being an important diplomat sent across Europe to negotiate treaties only to find yourself standing beside a giant bed while the king, half asleep and bundled like a human dumpling, mumbles something about taxes. Truly majestic. Royal beds were decorated like mini castles. Because beds were political symbols, they were constructed with thick carved wooden frames, embroidered canopies, velvet hangings, linen curtains, gold thread, of course, and sometimes saintly relics sewn into the mattress. The curtains weren't just decorative. They helped trap heat around the king like a tiny hut inside the massive stone bedroom. Essentially, the real winter survival strategy wasn't the fireplace, it wasn't the dogs, it wasn't the fur blankets, it was the bed itself transformed into an insulated sleeping fortress. A soft, cozy royal fortress that took 3 hours to get in and out of. Night watches and late visitors. Now, even after everyone left the room, the king was almost never truly alone. Guards rotated constantly outside the door, listening for trouble. Doctors were sometimes on call, sleeping nearby in case the king coughed strangely. Pages and attendants waited for bells or whistles. And occasionally, when it was politically convenient, a noble would request a midnight audience, because approaching the king while he was drowsy and wrapped in blankets made him just a tiny bit easier to persuade. Medieval politics, less sword fighting, more sleep interrupting. The strange calm of the medieval night. But despite all the rituals, intrusions, and awkward political performances, there were moments, sometime after midnight, when everything finally quieted down. The castle settled, the wind eased, the torches burned low, and the layers of curtains around the bed created a small pocket of warmth. Inside that little cocoon, the king finally drifted into the slow, heavy sleep of someone who lived through a long, exhausting, slightly ridiculous medieval day. And for a few hours at least, winter felt bearable.
Let's drift a little further into the night, into one of the stranger winter routines inside a medieval castle. The constant, delicate effort to keep the king warm without waking him up. Because kings did not simply sleep, they had to be kept warm, protected, monitored, and occasionally fussed over like very expensive houseplants. And that job fell to some of the youngest and most exhausted members of the royal household, the pages and valets. The page who slept on the floor. Every medieval king had a small team of boys or young men, pages, who slept inside or right outside the royal bedchamber. Not in beds, of course. Don't be silly. Most of them slept on the floor, on straw mats, wrapped in old blankets, wearing every layer of clothing they owned, positioned strategically near the king's bed. This was not comfortable, but it was considered an honor because it meant close access to royal favor. It's hard to imagine something both glamorous and miserable at the same time, but that was medieval court service in a nutshell. Their main job: heat maintenance. These pages had one crucial responsibility during harsh winters: keep the king from freezing without disturbing his precious sleep, which meant they had to monitor the fire, add wood slowly and quietly, adjust the curtains around the bed, close any shutters rattling in the wind, retrieve warm bricks or stones to place at the king's feet, make sure no cold drafts crept into the canopy bed, and occasionally crawl around in the dark like silent medieval ninjas, all while staying absolutely silent. This was an environment where knocking over a log or stepping on the wrong floorboard could end a career. The fireplace ballet. Fireplaces in royal rooms were huge, but they were also temperamental. They sputtered, they hissed, they smoked with no warning. They let in gusts of wind like rude, icy ghosts. So the poor page, half asleep, freezing, and covered in soot, had to perform what was basically a sad, slow-motion ballet. Lift a log, gently place it, ease the sparks down, whisper to the embers like they were misbehaving pets, and if even one spark jumped too loudly, the king might stir, and then the page's heart rate would spike to a level that probably took 10 years off his life. Warm bricks, hot stones, and desperate measures. In truly brutal winters, the sleeping arrangements got creative. Servants heated bricks or stones in the large kitchen ovens, then carried them, wrapped in cloth, to the king's room. They slid them under the bed, between the mattresses, at the king's feet, near the queen, or around the dog, who also produced heat. The goal was simple: make the bed a tiny insulated island of warmth inside a cold, cavernous stone room that never fully heated, no matter how many logs were thrown into the fireplace. And occasionally, the stones were too hot, which meant the king woke up shouting because his feet felt like they were being roasted. There were many dangers in medieval kingship. Burning your own toes on a poorly managed warming stone was a surprisingly common one. The dog was an official source of heat. One of the most reliable heating devices in the medieval royal bedroom wasn't made of stone, brick, or wool. It had 4 legs. Royal dogs, usually small or medium-sized lapdogs, were intentionally kept in bed as living heaters. And the king's dog had better job security than most courtiers, because unlike humans, dogs never spoke out of turn, asked for favors, started political factions, or tried to manipulate the king's decisions while he was sleepy. Plus, they radiated a wonderfully steady heat. So yes, medieval power partly depended on strategic snuggling. A cold draft could ruin everything. One issue dominated every winter night: drafts. Drafts came through doors, windows, loose roof tiles, gaps in stone walls, cracks in wooden floors, and sometimes just mysteriously. A sudden cold breeze could wake the king, make him grumpy, or worse, get someone blamed for neglecting royal comfort, a serious offense in the weird political ecosystem of the palace. So pages spent half the night holding fabric, plugging gaps, and adjusting curtains like sleep-deprived human weatherproofing. Every small movement was part of a quiet war against nature. And yet, the king still didn't sleep well, despite the canopy, the layers of fur, the heated stones, the roaring fire, the diligent pages, the loyal dogs, and the enormous bed. Medieval kings still didn't sleep very well. Castles were cold, noisy, drafty, and endlessly active. Someone was always moving in the corridors. Someone else was always awake. Someone was always whispering news, carrying messages, or guarding something. A king's sleep was rarely deep. It was light, cautious, and easily disturbed. Even wrapped like a royal cocoon, he slept with the awareness that the world outside his curtains was always shifting, and often trying to kill him. A relaxing thought for bedtime. Final part. Drifting out of the medieval night. So, let's settle one last time into that quiet medieval darkness. The castle is still. The torches have burned low. The great halls have emptied. The fireplaces are whispering their last little pops of heat. And somewhere behind layers of wool, fur, velvet, and thick curtains, the king finally rests. Not comfortably, not deeply, not the way we think of sleep today, but enough. Enough to make it through another cold dawn. Enough to rise, face advisors, sign decrees, bless arguments, and complain about taxes. Enough to keep a kingdom running with only a few hours of uneven winter rest. Because medieval kings did not sleep like royalty. They slept like survivors, wrapped in fabric, surrounded by servants, clutching warmth wherever they could find it. And that strange combination of luxury and discomfort is what defined royal life more than the crowns or the jewels or the flickering power. A king's bed may have been gilded, enormous, embroidered, perfumed, and layered like a woolen fortress, but the cold still crept in at night. The drafts still found their way through the stones. The world outside the curtains still threatened to intrude, and even the most powerful man in the realm was, in the end, just another human being, trying to stay warm on a bitter medieval winter night. So, if you're lying somewhere cozy right now, wrapped in a blanket, maybe listening with one eye half closed, feeling your room gently warming around you, congratulations. You officially have a better sleeping arrangement than 99% of medieval royalty. Thanks for drifting through history with me tonight. If this slow wander through cold stone halls helped you relax, a quiet little like or a soft tap on the subscribe button is always appreciated. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time for another forgotten, quietly ridiculous corner of history.